And sexual activity may not be declining in the U.S., but birth rates definitely are. The fertility rate of women in the U.S. fell to a record low for the second year in a row in 2012, according to data released by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The fertility rate is the number of births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44. According to the December 2013 report in 2012, the U.S. fertility rate was 63. That was down about 1% from 63.2 in 2011, which is the previous all-time low. It marked the fifth year in a row that the U.S. birth rate has declined and the lowest rate on record since the government started tracking the fertility rate in 1909. So what is causing this falling birth rate? To give us some insight on that, I was joined earlier by Andrew Foster. He's the director of the Population Studies and Training Center at Brown University. I first asked him if people are postponing childbirth because of economic conditions.
Even though there's been an overall sort of upturn in the U.S. economy since the crisis, you still see very high unemployment or underemployment among the youth population. So it's not surprising when you're particularly interviewing those groups that they're uncertain about their futures, and obviously a child is a major long-term commitment.
Sure. Well, let's take a look at the other side of this, because some people say that it has more to do, or at least equally to do, with more education and higher rates of contraception or use of contraception. In fact, people have even pointed specifically to shows like MTV's 16 and Pregnant or Teen Mom. Is there any evidence to support that that is indeed contributing?
Well, in terms of to take the last point, that there is sort of evidence in the context of the developing world that media plays a big role in people sort of identifying with small families. I think in terms of trying to sort out what's happening in the U.S., there really isn't any very strong evidence on that point. The other thing I would say is that while you can see a sort of small blip in fertility, when measured properly, in fact, U.S. fertility has been fairly stable, remarkably stable actually, for 25 years, particularly when you look at the 50 years preceding that. So I don't think that you want to make a big deal of a relatively small change over 45 years.
Interesting. Well, Andrew, as far as I understand it, it is very important for the population to replace itself, at least for economic reasons. If the birth rate does continue to drop, and perhaps a little bit more dramatically, could this really affect the future of the labor force, for example?
Well, I think the main thing to realize that most of the people who will enter the labor force over the next 25 years, at least of the native population, have already been born. So we're not going to see any sort of major decline in the labor force in the U.S. as a result of a declining birth rate for 20 years or so. After that, yes, there will be decline, and any sort of change in the size or composition of population requires the economy to respond. But if we're talking about a period of 20 years, you can see things like sort of more robotics and so forth replacing labor. So from a sort of production standpoint, it doesn't seem to be so critical. There'll be ample time for the economy to kind of figure out how to deal with a relative shortage of sort of new workers. From a labor perspective.
So you think it might adapt. Does the government, do you think at least the government bears any responsibility in trying to sort of lift that birth rate? And furthermore, what can be done to restore the population, or at least make sure that it doesn't dwindle the way it has in, say, Japan?
Well, in my view, the government has a clear role in sort of ensuring that that children have adequate health care and good quality education, and those things will in turn, I think, make it easier for families to think about childbearing and understand that they can do that and they can successfully raise a child. So rather than sort of directly intervening on the fertility side, I would say that sort of making it easier to be a parent through the availability of those kinds of services is a place for the government to step in, and I think those can have the desired effects you're talking about.
Indeed, those things need to be put in place. Andrew Foster, professor at Brown University, thank you.